Well, good morning. Thank you. I didn't make that, but thank you. Would you pray with me, please? Heavenly Father, Lord, this morning we pray for focus. Lord, as we spend time diving into your word this morning, Lord, knowing that it is the most important thing that we can do. Lord, I pray that you shut out all the other distractions, the football games, the apps on the phone, whatever it is, Lord, and just help us to focus on you, that we might learn from you this morning. Pray that you give us ears to hear and hearts to listen to all that you have in store for us. In your name we pray. Amen. Well, last week we talked a little bit about focus, and this week we're going to talk a little bit more about focus. Because when we're focused on something, everything else just falls to the side. And ideally, last week we talked about focusing on the positive instead of the negative, focusing on the good in our lives. And ideally, the center and the foundation of our focus should always be Christ. Right? And this morning we're going to talk a little bit about focusing on Christ. But to be honest, there's often times that distractions come into our lives. I mean, have you ever been so focused on something that you missed everything else going on around you? I learned this lesson a hard way. When I was young, I got a kite, and it was my first kite. I don't know if you guys have ever flown a kite, but I was very excited to fly a kite. I came from a generation like just pre-video games and all that, so that was exciting to us, was flying a kite, right? And so I got this kite for Christmas, and I was so excited, and my stepdad showed me how to fly it, and I let out a bunch of string, and I would run really fast to get this kite up and going. Now, it wasn't windy enough to keep the kite up in the air by itself. You had to keep running to keep the kite moving, otherwise it was right? And for hours I worked at this. Sometimes I had a little bit of luck and the kite would go, and what I realized is I had a focus problem. You see, I would run really fast and I would get the kite going, and then I would stop and I would watch the kite, because that's the whole purpose of flying the kite, right? Is to watch the kite. Because otherwise I would just run and somebody would be like, "Oh yeah, it's great. It's flying," and I couldn't see. And so that was I didn't understand how to fly a kite, and so I would just stop and I would watch it, and then it would fall, and let out the string, stretch it all out, and run again. And we would do this. I would do this for most of the afternoon. And finally, my parents told me, "All right, it's time to come inside. It's getting late." And I thought, I want to end on a high note. It had been a little bit of a rocky day. Some were good, most were bad. And I've crashed this kite more than I've flown this kite at this point. I thought, I want to end on a high note. And so I let out a bunch of string, and I got it ready, and I ran, and I ran, and I saw it go, and it started to go, and then instead of stopping, I just kept running. And I kept watching the kite as I was running. And then boom, everything went black. You guys might have guessed. I smacked full speed at as fast as a 10-year-old could run into my neighbor's lifted truck. I had drifted off course, which is a message for another time, if losing focus and drifting off course. But I had drifted off the sidewalk and landed smack into the front of his parked truck, and it leveled me. I tried to tell him it was hit and run, but he didn't listen to me. But I hit the ground so hard, my shoes went flying off. They kept traveling. Don't know what happened to the kite. And I realized that sometimes we focus on the wrong things, and we lose focus on everything else around us. You see, if I had kept my focus, the story would have been much different. It would have been much better. I would have had this happy Christmas memory. Instead, that is the last time I've ever flown a kite. Just so we're clear. I don't fly kites, because I'm pretty sure I got a concussion from it. Now, there's a story in Matthew chapter 14, where the disciples are trying to focus on Jesus, but there's a lot of distractions going on. You see, Jesus had just gotten done feeding 5,000 people, which is really closer to 12 or 14,000 people, and he sends the disciples off into this boat, and the storms come, and they're freaking out, and they're getting crazy, and Jesus calls them to focus on him, but there's a lot going on, and it's a tricky moment. If you will, and you have a Bible, Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 24. It says, immediately he made the disciples, this is right after feeding the 5,000. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, the lake of, or the Sea of Galilee. while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountains by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. Verse 24. But the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. You see, Jesus stayed behind to pray to God, and he sent the disciples out on a routine. Most of them are fishermen. Most of them have spent their whole life at sea. This is not a crazy voyage for them, right? But the waves have come, and the boat is rocking, and the first thing that they realize is they don't have Jesus. Which, if we're being honest, losing Jesus as your friend group is a big problem. But most importantly, they realize that without Jesus, everything becomes a lot scarier. You're talking about Jesus, the Messiah, but even before they understood him as the Messiah, Jesus is the really awesome rabbi who makes things happen, right? Jesus is the guy who performs miracles, who questions authority, and all the authority figures, they all step down to Jesus because they can't understand how great he is. Jesus is your best friend that gets you out of all this trouble, and all of a sudden they realize, oh my goodness, the waves are getting choppy, it's getting crazy, and we don't have Jesus. And if we're going to focus on Jesus, there's really a couple of things that we need to get rid of so that we're not too distracted to focus on Jesus. The first is fear. You see, Jesus goes to meet with his disciples, and he says this in verse 25. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, that's Jesus, walking on the sea. But the disciples saw him walking on the sea, and they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." The waves have gotten crazy, and Jesus walks out on water to them. And this isn't like on a beach somewhere. This is the middle of the Sea of Galilee. It's deep. It's crazy. The waters are choppy, and Jesus is standing in deep water. He's standing on top of deep water. And the rational response to all of these fishermen is, oh my goodness, it must be a ghost. And they are terrified. That even when Jesus calls to them, they don't understand at first because of how terrified they are. You ever been there? Stuck in a situation where there's just so much going on and so much fear that it's hard to locate what is truly happening. Because rationally, the disciples know we need Jesus to make this problem better. And rationally, they understand when Jesus calls them, hey, Jesus is here. But in our lives, because of our human nature, because of whatever's going on in our lives, sometimes focusing on Jesus becomes a difficult task. Sometimes understanding that that is Jesus and not something terrifying becomes much, much harder. There's a lot of fear going on with the disciples. You know, storms in life, they look different to us. Some of them will look like actual storms. We got a pretty nice little baby monsoon storm not too long ago this week, right? Hopefully some of you got it. I know that Tucson has a couple of different weather things, so some of us got it, some of us didn't. You'll have to imagine if you missed it. I was laying in bed. It's late. I don't know what time it was, but I go to bed about 8:30, so it was late for me, whatever time it was. And I was laying in bed, and I heard we bought a little plastic pool for my son, and it just wobbles against the one of the little plastic ones. It wobbles against the porch, and I just hear boom, 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 boom. And of course, rationally speaking, as a good, God-fearing man, my first thought is, oh my goodness, someone is coming into my house. Because that's what your natural thought is, right? And then I had to take a moment and realize, no, it's just the pool and the wind and the rain. And I realized that though when I went to bed, there was not a cloud in the sky, the rain had come and the wind had come, and with it was all of the craziness that is really only windstorms in Tucson, by the way. I've been all over the place, and I've never seen a windstorm like that. But the beach ball went flying, the pool was hammering against the house, something else fell down. And in that moment, I realized that sometimes our fears prey on us, and and our distractions. Because the most logical thing is, yes, 2 hours before I went to bed, I put the pool up against the wall so that it wouldn't blow away. That makes perfect sense that it would hit the wall. But the irrational spot, because I'm tucked into bed, warm and cozy, and I got my fancy pillow and the whole bit, is, oh my goodness, someone is breaking into the house. And I don't know if you guys have been here, but the next rational thought is it worth it to get up or should we just stay here? I don't know if you guys have been there, but that was the next thought is, it is what it is at this point. I'd rather stay here at that. But fear plays tricks on us. And when storms come in life, they look different. Because not every time is it a actual natural phenomenon storm. And sometimes it's financial trouble. That's a storm in life. Sometimes we lose a job and all of a sudden it becomes really hard to focus on Jesus because now we have to figure out how to adapt and how to fix the family and how to keep everything together quickly. Sometimes it's a move. Sometimes it's a call to move and we don't move. The storms of life look different, but they all cause the same thing, and it's fear and a distraction from Jesus. It's interesting, in the beginning of Matthew, Jesus goes out to the desert and he's tempted by the devil. And the devil promises him all these things, and he says, all you have to do is just worship me. And he tries 3 different times, and he tries all these things, but the last one he tells Jesus is, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. All you have to do is just bow down to me now. And what's interesting is the devil knows he won't beat Jesus. Spoilers, the entire Bible. The devil knows he won't beat Jesus. He won't beat God. He's lost already. But what he can do is he can distract not just Jesus, but he can distract all of us from focusing on Jesus. And that becomes the next game plan. That becomes the next idea. Because shortly here later is this great storm, and the closest people to Jesus instantly start freaking out. But the story continues. Verse 27 or 28. Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. You gotta love Peter. Everybody else is terrified, and Peter's like, well, look, this is my shot. If it's Jesus, we're doing big things here, guys. 29. He said, being Jesus, come. So Peter got out of the boat, and he walked on water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and began to sink. There's a lot of distractions that we face in our daily life. But if we are to focus on Jesus, we can't be distracted. We got to get rid of the distractions in our life. This is a powerful moment. Jesus is standing on the water, and Peter, knowing who God is, knowing who Jesus is, says, call to me and I can do anything if you let me do it. That's how strong his faith is. Peter, on some level, understands. Now listen, Peter's the guy, he puts his foot in his mouth, he does some silly things. If you read the gospel, Peter is a fantastic, very relatable person. But on some level, he knows who Jesus is, and so he calls to him and he says, come to me. And Jesus says, well, come. Come on. And Peter gets out and he starts to walk on water, and I have to imagine as long as he's focusing on Jesus, he's walking on water. Waves crashing around them. Because remember, these were seasoned fishermen who thought, oh my goodness, we're going to sink this boat. It's not flat water. There's waves crashing around them. It's dark. It's late. All these things are going on. Everybody else seems to be terrified because nobody else wanted to get out of the boat. Peter steps out of the boat. And he's looking at Jesus and he's walking. But he notices everything else around him. And in that moment, he starts to sink. Because the moment we get distracted from Jesus, we no longer pursue Jesus. I'm curious what Peter was thinking. I find myself often wondering what Peter was thinking throughout the Bible. But in the moment, Peter calls to Jesus, and Jesus calls him to come. And Peter gets out of the boat, and he's focused on Jesus, and he's walking. But then he saw the wind and was afraid. As soon as he looked about and thought, oh man, this is such a cool moment. There's so much going on. Or maybe he thought, oh my goodness, look at how crazy it is, or how loud it is, or any of those things. He started to sink. And then as soon as he started to sink, panic set in. And it's interesting too. I don't know how many of us have ever jumped into a lake or a pond or a swimming pool or anything like that. You don't sink slowly. The passage is Peter is starting to sink. In verse 30, when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. That is a slow creep. Right? Because if you are standing on top of something that is not strong, you don't have time to call out and say, oh my goodness, help me. You're just underwater. So, not only does Peter start to walk on water, he slowly sinks into the water. And I have to imagine that there's a moment where if he had focused back on Jesus, Peter could have got back up. But because he started to sink, his fear set in, his distractions and his fear, and they separated him from his pursuit of Jesus. Too often they do the same for us. Too often we know that all things are powerful. All things are capable through Jesus. Jesus is capable of all things, and we are capable of doing things with him. But somehow we fill our days without him. Somehow we marginalize Jesus onto the side of our lives because we are just so busy with things. And then we start to panic when things don't go our way. Somehow we can isolate Jesus to a Sunday morning and spend our whole week running around, trying to make ends meet, trying to do things, and then wonder, Jesus, why are you not helping me here? Because we've lost focus. Because we're no longer pursuing Jesus, we're pursuing these other things. Peter steps on the water, and the most important thing is Jesus standing there beside him, already standing on the water. Peter steps out and he starts to walk, and as he starts to walk, it has to be one of the most surreal moments. Remember, Peter's a fisherman. He spent his whole life on water. I guarantee you that just because Peter is a guy, at some point he's tried running across the water and jumping out of the boat. It's not in the Bible, but I guarantee you, just being a guy, like, he's tried running across water or doing silly things because he spent his whole life on the water, and that's what you do. You start to just play around and have fun and all of these things with it. So this is like a mind-blowing dream for Peter, on top of being a miracle. But at some point, he looks over and he stops focusing on Jesus, starts focusing on the wind. Notice it's the wind and not the waves. The waves are coming. It's bouncy, it's choppy water, but it's the wind that catches Peter's attention. It's the noise that gets Peter. And how often is it the noise that gets us? How often do we get caught up listening to the wrong people? How often do we get caught up in situations where we just feel so overstimulated by all the noise, all the craziness, that it's hard to focus on something? And I don't know if Peter heard the disciples talking back in the boat. The wind carried it. I don't know if it was just the rush of the wind. I don't know what Peter heard exactly, but it drew his attention for just a moment. And that's all it took. Just a moment. And he started to sink. He started to panic. Because the third thing that we need to watch out for is, if we're going to focus on Christ, we need to remove doubt. There's no place for doubt. After Peter stepped on, after he was doing well, as soon as things got difficult, Peter started to doubt what God could do for him or what was happening. Verse 31, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why do you doubt?" And then they got in the boat, and the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." It's a wild exchange. There's a wild, crazy moment, and as Peter starts to sink and he calls out to God for help, I don't know if he was almost there. I don't know if he was 10 feet away. I don't know if he was 15 feet away. But instantly, Jesus is there, and he pulls him from the water. And they get in the boat together, and he tells Peter, "O ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" So hard to focus on Jesus. That we can think that we're doing really well and we're reading our Bible and we're spending time in prayer and we think that we're focusing on Jesus, but then something comes up in life. We start to question, man, is God really going to be there? Is God really going to help us? We can read our Bibles every day. We can spend time in prayer, spend time with God. We can go to church on Sundays. But when real things come up in life, and there are plenty of real things that come up in our lives, death of a loved one, disease, bad news from the doctors, financial troubles, loss of job, loss of a friend. There's all these things that come up in our lives, and when we start to question, man, why isn't God helping? We start to say, well, if God really loved me, then he would do these things. He would help me with these things. And in that moment, we start to doubt that God can actually do what God does. And if we're going to focus on God, there can be no doubt left. Because doubt is a foothold that Satan will use to whittle his way and sever this connection that we try and grow. Because if Peter didn't doubt, then he could have got back up. Because if Peter didn't doubt, we'd be telling a different story this morning. A story of great faith. And what's interesting is, like I said in verse 31, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and he took hold of him, saying to him, "O ye of little faith, why do you doubt?" As you read forward in the story, as Jesus goes to be crucified, as he's resurrected, as the church starts, Peter is the cornerstone of God's church. Peter is the one who, despite all of his other shortcomings, has true faith in Jesus. And he stands beside him. There is the whole thing with the rooster and all that, if you look. But after all of that, after Peter has a moment with the resurrected Jesus, Peter is all in. And he's no longer the one of little faith. He's no longer the one who doubts. He's the one who knows without a shadow of a doubt that Jesus is who he says he is. But for Peter, and it takes time. Peter has multiple shortcomings from this moment, multiple moments of doubt, before he gets to a place where we remember him at. It gets to a place where he's the lead of the first church. You know, it's interesting. Peter catches a lot of flack, if you will. A lot of people tease Peter for being the guy who got out of the boat and he fell down. But I look at the story a little bit differently. Yeah, Peter has some shortcomings. Peter's the one who got out of the boat. All of the disciples are there. Matthew, John. All of the disciples are there, and Peter's the only one who calls out to him. And I don't know if Peter thought he was being snarky at first or whatever, but he's the one who gets out of the boat. See, if we're going to focus on God, and we're going to cast off doubt, we're going to cast off fear, we're going to cast off all of these other things, then we need to take a step of faith at some point. If we're going to focus on Christ and we're going to grow closer to God, we need to take a step of faith. Notice you can't get any closer to God in the boat. All the disciples sitting in the boat, probably cowering, probably looking, probably wishing that they could have had the strength to step out. But they didn't take that step of faith. They didn't decide that pursuing Jesus was worth everything. See, of all the things, the boat is comfort. The boat is comfortable because even though the seas are rocky, if you didn't have a boat, that would be far worse. You guys have ever seen the movie The Titanic, and it's just like a little piece of wood drifting in the water? That would be far worse. That would be crazy. But they have a boat, and let's face it, they know how to use the boat. Most of them are fishermen. And even though the waves are coming, even though it's crazy, even though it's choppy waters, even though it's dark, all of these things, the boat is a comfortable place to be in. Because even though it's not perfect, it's what they know. And oftentimes we will sit in our lives and we will stay with what we know as opposed to taking a step of faith for God. Because it's what we know. Now listen, it doesn't mean that our lives are perfect. It doesn't mean that our lives are even great. There could be a lot of baggage here, a lot of messed up things here. But it's what we know. It's what we trust. And the question this morning is, do we trust Jesus enough to get out of the boat? And look, it's fun to say yes. And it's something that I know that each and every one of us believe that we hope would be true. But this morning, I want to take a real look. This morning, I want to take a moment and think through, would we sacrifice the comfort that we know to take a step of faith for God? Even if that step meant falling. And on top of that, it's not just one step. You see, Peter takes the first step. Lord, forgive me for stepping on the chair. Peter takes the first step, and he's good. He's looking at Jesus. First step's not always the hardest step, right? He got out of the boat. He took the first step. He's standing on the water. He's looking out at Jesus. It's the next step that gets him. It's the next. Because sometimes we'll take that first step. We'll say, yeah, I'll take a sacrifice for Jesus. It looked good. This worked out well. I took that job. I prayed about it. I thought it would work. I took that chance, whatever it is. And we stand and we think, all right, yeah, I can take a sacrifice. I can take a step of faith. But what happens to the next one? Do you guys think that Peter ever looked back and said, oh man, I can't believe I fell in the water? Do you think Peter ever looked back and said, I should have stayed in the boat? I don't know how many of us have taken a step of faith for God, but I guarantee you, whether the step goes as planned or we fall, that step of faith is intimately and ultimately better than staying in the boat. That if we are going to focus on the things going on in our lives, the centerpiece to focus on is Christ. And that if we focus on God, everything else will fall to the wayside. As I invite the worship team to come up, I want to close with this thought. We are designed not to focus on everything all at once. Our mind can't comprehend it as human beings. And I know there's a lot of us that go, well, I'm really great at multitasking. You are lying to yourself. I've done it multiple times in my life. I get it. Our mind can't focus on everything all at once because we're not designed to be that way. And where our focus is where 90% of our thought process goes. The same way that when we focus on good things, it helps us to have a better day. The same way that when we focus on God, everything else falls away. Peter steps out into the water, and he's looking at God, and none of the rest of it bothers him for a moment. Listen, I don't know if you guys have ever been on choppy seas, but it's not smooth whatsoever. It's not rolling waves. It's not like being next to the beach. It's these huge boat-womping waves. None of that matters. He's focused. The people calling, yelling, "What are you doing? You're so crazy." None of that matters. He's focused. Wind is howling. It's loud. It's crazy. You can't hear yourself think. None of that matters. He's focused on Jesus. Not until he allowed his focus to shift did he start to see the other things going on. Not until we decide that it's Jesus and something else in our life does our life start to shift. Not until we decide to pursue other things that our focus drifts. We're meant to focus on one thing at a time. This morning, I challenge us. Let it be Jesus. And as we focus on Jesus, I pray that we have the strength to step out of the boat, out of our comfort into what God has for us. Because whether we sink in that moment, whether we stand in that moment, God's plan is intimately and ultimately better than our plan. Every time. Peter had no idea what he would become. Peter had no inclination of how much would transpire and where he would end up, but he knew in that moment it was worth chasing God. And the same is true for us. Would you pray with me, please? Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you for this moment. I thank you for relatable stories, for the moments that you spent with your disciples and the time that we can understand. The choice to stay in something comfortable or to step out in faith. And Lord, I pray that this week you give us the strength to focus on you and step out in faith. Or to follow you no matter where you call us, no matter what it looks like. And Lord, to just cast off everything that hampers us in that pursuit. Or to cast off fear, distraction, and doubt. All of the things that separate us from you. Knowing that you are enough, that you are more than enough for each and every one of us. And I pray that you help us to focus on you this morning, this week. We love you and we praise you. In your name we pray. Amen. Well, thank you so much. If you are able, please stand and join us for a song of celebration.